Um, Equally as important as the level of risk that banks take is how far do they go to protect themselves from these risks. So it's okay to take a lot of risk as long as you have a commensurate amount of risk protection. So just summing that up because I think that's an important concept as well. Okay, so let's start by thinking about asset risk here. So someone tell me what asset risk is. And if no one knows, can someone take a guess? If no one can take a guess, then I'll take a guess. Jackson?
The risk of losing your assets or
Yeah.
losing money on them?
Yeah, basically it's the risk of some of your assets being worse than you expected, so you have to write them off or charge them off.
Worse meaning like undervalued?
Not so. Undervalued sounds like it might be better. But because if something's undervalued,
Right.
you want to buy it.
Or
Overvalued.
overvalued.
I think overvalued would be the correct word
Yeah.
to use, but it's not a word that comes up in this context often. It's basically you made a loan. The most important asset a bank has is a loan. You made a loan. You thought that borrower was going to pay. Turns out he can't. That is, I don't know, 60 to 70% of asset risk in a portfolio right there. The other asset risk sometimes comes from securities. You buy securities and you think they're going to pay off, but the corporation goes default. That's a much smaller percentage, and then there's other tiny bits and pieces. But it's basically you have an asset that you think is going to pay off, and it doesn't. Okay? So how does management mitigate against asset risk? And this is a very obvious answer, so if you think what you're about to say is too obvious, then it's probably it.
They manage it.
They manage. How do they manage it specifically?
They don't take it.
They don't take it. They have safer investments. They avoid it, right? That's probably the easiest way of managing asset risk is just not taking it. Another way of managing asset risk would be to hold a lot of capital. Like I said, it's okay to give really risky loans as long as you have a strong equity buffer that can absorb the losses. As long as you estimate the losses reasonably well and keep equity buffer commensurate with that estimate of losses. Now, if it's as easy as I say, why don't bank managers actually do this? Right? If it's just, oh, risk is bad, we have a lot of risk, or either A, let's not take risk, or B, let's hold a lot of equity to safeguard against that risk. Why don't bank managers do that? Elizabeth?
Because sometimes risk pays off.
Yes, and in fact, generally risk does pay off. So it's inefficient or it's costly from an opportunity cost point of view to hold a lot of capital. Because holding capital is basically just like reserving money, putting it to the side, and not deploying it otherwise profitably. It's just as costly not to make risky loans because risky loans pay more. So by making those risky loans, you have a higher expected payout unless something goes wrong. So it's costly for a bank just to focus on the perfectly riskless consumers if they exist. So that's why banks go out and make risky loans. Okay?
And aren't banks like not as risk averse as say like maybe us?
That's
Don't
a
you
good
think they're
question.
More risk neutral or like
I'd have to think about that one. So I don't know how they rank relative to us in risk aversion, but I know that they're better positioned to take a lot of risk. This was one of the benefits of financial intermediation from the beginning of our class is if you and I give out $30,000, then that's most of all my wealth, at least. I don't know about you guys. But if a bank gives out $30,000, they're taking in so much money from so many different sources that even if that whole loan goes defunct and then some, they'll be able to bear it without a problem. So it's not, maybe they are more risk averse, maybe they're less risk averse, I'm not sure, but they're better positioned to take risk.
right.
That makes sense. So liquidity risk. So can somebody explain to me what liquidity risk is? A little less obvious, but still intuitive, I think.
The risk,
Fabian or Jackson?
the risk of losing money or not being able to profit from the buy and sell of the security.
Okay, I'm trying to stretch that into the answer, but, let's see what Fabian has first.
It's the risk of not being able to sell, security or something like that because of the risk that it has on it.
Yes, that's definitely part of it. Did I see another hand?
Yeah, well, the reason you have to convert faster into cash.
Yes, I think that's probably the closest I've heard to the answer. It's the situation that arises when you need to pay off a liability today, all right? How are you gonna do that? You're gonna do that by liquidating your assets. And so if you don't have liquid assets, then you have a lot of liquidity risk. And that means if for some reason the need to pay off your liabilities today would arise, you wouldn't be able to do that. You'd have to sell your assets at fire sale prices and lose lots of money on them. Does that make sense? So liquidity risk is sort of the risk that you wouldn't be able to convert your assets quickly enough to cash or liquidity. Okay? So it's easiest to think of that from the asset side. But there's also, okay, so, no, back up. So when we get to risk management, how would a bank manager go about managing liquidity risk then?
Diversification.
Diversification, in what sense, Crystal?
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Sure, that's a good definition of diversification. So if liquidity risk is the risk that you won't be able to sell off certain assets, or to sell off assets quickly enough at a reasonable enough price to meet your liquidity needs, then one way to manage liquidity risk would just be to hold a lot of liquid assets, to hold a lot of cash, right? Does everyone see how that's an effective means of managing liquidity risk? Okay. There's another way though. That's asset side liquidity management, liquidity risk management. There's liability side liquidity risk management. That is that conversely, banks can hold a really high borrowing capacity. Just like you and I might have a lot of credit cards. So if for some reason we have a lot of unexpected expenses, we can just pop out our credit cards and pay for them. Conversely, some people, who are in the slums might not have a lot of credit cards. And so if they have liquidity needs that arise, they won't be able to rely on this liability side liquidity risk management tool. Does that make sense? So there's asset side liquidity risk management and liability side liquidity risk management. So what?
Other question, you said hold liquidable assets, but cash is not a liquid, cash is cash. Doesn't necessarily.
Cash is a liquid asset. Cash is the most liquid asset. Okay.
Was.
What's up?
What's the second most liquidable asset other than cash?
Probably due from account or something, just a bank account that you have with another bank.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
when we wrote down the balance sheet, we wrote it down in order of liquidity, I'm pretty sure. So if you guys want to look on balance sheet, and I think that's the same order that the book has it in. So generally when balance sheets are written, they're written from mostly liquidity. And one more thing about the borrowing lines is credit cards are one example, but when you and I, for instance, want to get a home equity loan, okay? We're going to go to the bank and we're going to have to pledge collateral, that is our home. That's the collateral. So when banks go out and secure liability side liquidity, that is when they secure borrowing capacity from other financial institutions, namely the Federal Reserve or the Federal Home Loan Bank, they're going to have to pledge stuff. And so they either pledge securities or loans or both, okay? That's one other sort of important facet to keep in mind about securing liability side liquidity risk management. So again, I'll ask the same question. If it's so easy, what's the disadvantage of holding a lot of liquidity? So we'll start with asset side. What's the disadvantage of holding a lot of asset side liquidity? It's going to be very similar to the last answer you guys gave. which was, if you hold a lot of cash, that means you can't deploy that cash to more profitable uses, right? And likewise, before we defined cash as equity, which it is, now we're defining cash as liquidity, which it also is, and the same story goes, right? Also, if you'll think about it from a more general perspective, we talked about, did we talk about liquidity premiums? We briefly mentioned liquidity premiums, another reason why what they call T-bonds and T-bills and stuff trade at so low a yield is because they have this sort of liquidity premium in there. People are willing to accept less money for them just because these instruments are so liquid, right? And that's the general rule as well. If you talk about securities, if you talk about municipal securities, they're going to have sort of an illiquidity dimension in it. They're going to have an illiquidity cost. Because these securities are so illiquid, investors are going to demand a lot of, or some extra compensation to compensate them for the illiquidity risk. The risk that they won't be able to liquidate these instruments in quick enough time. So